All right. Thank you for joining us. This is the My OCD Care Courage series, and today we are honored to have Jamie Reed with us. Just to understand the nature of the series, a lot of anxiety specialists will focus on treating anxiety and reducing anxiety. And, we think, while that's important, it's very important also to focus on courage, which is doing, what's important to you, even in the presence of anxiety, and being very oriented towards finding, what's purposeful in your life and getting there, even in the presence of fear. So for the series, I like to interview people who I find courageous, and just understand the process, and hopefully, we could then find courage in our own lives. And yeah, so today we have Jamie Reed, who you may have heard of as the whistleblower for the Washington University Gender Clinic. I'm going to allow her to tell her story, and to kind of bring those who aren't familiar with the issue up to speed. But let's just start there, which is, how did people come to know you?
Hi, Elliot. Thank you for having me today.
You got it.
I really like the premise of your series. People in the general public came to know me probably seeming like I fell out of the sky sometime in mid-February of last year with an article that came out in the Free Press. It was an article that documented my time working in a pediatric transgender center here in St. Louis. I did not exist on social media before that article. I had no idea how many other people were working on this issue. I really kind of followed the news as a real general participant. So, I was reading newspaper online, but I drafted a story after I reached out and filed a complaint with the state's attorney general office here in the state of Missouri, because I had really serious concerns about the care that I was seeing in the center where I worked. And I felt like after a number of years trying to bring attention to that internally, I finally left the center and felt like my only recourse was to basically go public and reach out to the attorney general.
Okay. So first it sounds like you started to bring attention to it within the center. And when that didn't work, you kind of took it to the next level. When did you first start noticing something was up within the center you worked at?
I quickly noticed some things were not organized. So I had worked in a large medical institution for a long, long time. And I think similarly, you work in mental health. I work and have worked in adjacent kind of realms. I am not a clinical social worker, never claimed one, but I have worked in case management roles. And so in years of having roles like that, places are organized, places have procedures in places and policies, and they have a lot of levels of those kind of things worked out well in advance. And what I noticed quite quickly was just how kind of off the cuff and not really planned out the center that I came to work at was. So examples, there was no written policies or procedures. I took on the role as a case manager. Normally case managers, like therapists, will have a specific client list or a, Sometimes people use a patient list or a client list, but you know how many patients you're roughly going to be serving. You know what you're supposed to be doing. You kind of have a layout of your job. And in essence, I was the only case manager for every single patient, which turned into well over 1,000. Hugely inappropriate numbers for those kind of positions. And, there really was just a lot of, we're figuring this out as we do it, which seemed really haphazard for what we were actually doing.
Right. Okay. So it sounds like the first thing you noticed was the disorganization, both in terms of patient management and also the patient care itself. So I think there's definitely a lot of large mental health centers that have organizational challenges. What brought it to the level of like concern, where you're like, something needs to change or people's safety is at risk?
People's safety and things need to change took a while. But really from the beginning, I think people who work in these kind of roles recognize the need for clear and concise boundaries and ethical guidelines. And so, we had a few other team members who maybe didn't have the same length of experience working in roles like this. And I just saw ethical boundaries and ethical issues really from the beginning. So, there are some basics. You don't put a client in your car to transport them. You don't give clients money. You don't, give out a personal phone number. You have ethical boundaries. And this center really seemed to not put those elements front and center. And part of that is intentionally in the nature of what centers like this are doing. So they're intentionally hiring community members, people who, on staff who say that they're from the LGBT. And then they are intentionally trying to, there are a lot of ethical questions even in the beginning. So similarities to Tavistock, when you have a parent organization who pushes for the center to be in existence in the first place, you already have some concerns about the ethical nature of what's going on. So the center I worked at was started almost exactly the same way. We were created because of a parent group who pushed and pushed and wanted to see it created. And then there was a lot of overlapping interactions with these activist groups too, that in retrospect lead to those blurry ethical boundaries and ethical lines for care. And I think it's part of that structure and how these things are built that leads to situations where you essentially come to a position where no one has ever told no. And that was one of the concerning things that I continued to see. Not everybody should be assessed in the same exact way. Not everybody should meet guidelines. And when every patient that presents does, you start to recognize that there's a fundamental problem in the entire structure itself.
Right. Okay. So kind of like the fact that, you have a whole varied population all kind of going down the same route kind of raised those alarm bells.
Yeah, everybody was getting, unless the parents put up a roadblock, it was really, if a kid said they wanted this, it was just that's what everybody got. And that didn't seem like clinical assessment work. It didn't seem like diagnostic work. And it didn't seem to be like really grounded in any guidelines too, because guidelines are created because you have to fit within them. And if somebody has to fit without it, or else it's just all whatever you want, you get.
Yeah. And was it specifically a pediatric
Yes.
gender center?
Yes.
Okay. What made you decide to work in that area to begin with? What attracted you to that type of care?
I've always worked well with youth populations. So adults are, I don't know, adults aren't boring, but there's a little bit more of a
Some of us
challenge.
are.
There's a little bit more of a challenge with pediatric populations. I feel like I can develop rapport with kids pretty quickly. I have a lot of my own kids, so I actually just like children in general. But I also have always liked the uniqueness of pediatric populations because you have to balance these different elements. So in pediatrics and adolescents and teens, you're balancing this growth towards independence, while at the same time, you should still have those parental oversights and how parents are working to slowly let go and teach, while also knowing when they need to be overseeing. And so a lot of what I've always found interested in is those kind of places where medicine and then social work and then kind of anthropological like data overlap, and that really is in these shifting populations. So adolescence is just these kind of populations where all of these different things are coming together at once, and you have to be able to think through all of those different elements. I also find pediatrics really interesting from a mental health standpoint because we see a lot of the really significant lifelong mental health conditions often arise in adolescence. And so I like to think of it too as being almost a first line of defense. So things like finding adolescents before they have a first real schizophrenic break. And so if you can keep them from having multiple periods like that. Bipolar disorder, some of these major depressive disorders, I just feel like adolescence is that realm where if you can intervene quickly and early, you can potentially have a lifelong impact in a lot of those mental health conditions. So I got into that role because I always gravitated to working with youth. And then I started working in the gender center. In some ways, it was like a natural trajectory. I worked in a Planned Parenthood. I worked with patients who are HIV positive. I work with young people who are HIV positive. And I was seeing this overlap with gender questioning and transgender patients in my HIV population. And then the tipping point for me was a PBS documentary. I believe it was on Frontline. And I remember watching it when it first aired and thinking, wow, this is cutting edge. This is the new realm. And it was all about medically transitioning children and young people. And I just thought, this is what lines up with all of these decades of experience I've had, and this is what I should be doing.
Wow. Okay. So you really, it seemed like a really great fit. And then you're there, and then you're seeing that the disorganization, the kind of the lack of boundaries, and that got concerning to you. So at what point, I guess, could you speak of like when you started to realize like, hey, I need to say something? What was there any kind of internal struggle you were experiencing? Like any kind of concerns you had, any thinking like, you know what, they probably know what they're talking about? Like, what was the internal process for you at the point where you're like, something's wrong and I should do something about it?
That's an emotionally tough question. And the reason is because a lot of my formulation around my thinking that something is wrong and I should speak up about it came to light because I didn't feel like I was completely alone in my concerns. So I had interactions with other staff members who were sharing similar concerns about similar patients. And so maybe at first, the overall model wasn't what came into question for me at first. It would be individually presenting patients. And so we would have a weekly team, supposed to be kind of a case conference where you could bring up a patient. We would talk through the patient. And, remember, this team was quite dispersed. So originally, the center thought that they would have maybe 50 patients total. We would only see patients, a little bit of time during one clinic a week. And then we were pulling in psychology, psychiatry, these different divisions, not as full-time staff. No one else on the entire team was full-time in this work except for myself and later the nurse. And so we would have these team conferences where we would, bring up a patient, normally a patient who is going to be maybe coming into clinic soon. And we would talk through the concerns. And what I continued to kind of see was patterns in the concerns. So patients who, in my assessment, were not meeting guidelines. Sometimes this would have been around things like previous trauma, where, you had a patient presenting clear previous trauma, never completed trauma therapy, was still, in really severe mental health crises too. And things where when I would read the spirit of WPATH guidelines, the spirit of them would tell me, you want patients to be in a reasonably good mental health place to make decisions around these things. And some of the debates that started coming up about patients was this kind of fundamental question, which I don't know that WPATH has ever truly answered, but what the providers were basically saying was the medical transition itself would cure the mental health. And I think some of the push-pull in some of the WPATH guidelines is that I don't know that we have data that says this cures a mental illness, and therefore they are kind of recommending that your mental health should be reasonably well controlled. So you don't want patients making life-altering decisions if they are actively suicidal. Somebody is not in the right position to do that. And then also, we would have disagreements around parental consents when you would have one parent who didn't agree and a parent who did. And so it slowly just became, case conference after case conference after case conference, where we would have these concerning patients where there would not be team cohesion and not team agreement. And there would be a real struggle to come to any sort of a solid ethical conclusion. And what I was finding in the case conferencing was that the hormone prescribers would utilize a multidisciplinary team on some level at face value and not really hold true what a multidisciplinary team is supposed to mean. My assessments, I'm not saying that my assessments were always, right or the correct analysis in the end, but you have roles like that on teams because I'm looking at things from a different viewpoint than an endocrinologist is, or from a psychiatrist, or from a dermatologist. I'm trying to look at this whole functioning unit, the whole family unit. How are the parents getting along? Where did this come from for the child? How long has this been persistent? All of these elements. And it just got to the point where some of us were saying these are not good candidates, yet everybody always got cleared in the end.
Right. So you started you started with individual concerns, and then you noticed this patterns of concerns. And it sounds like the fact that you weren't alone in your concerns was really helpful in realizing the problem is not you, and you just not understanding something, or you not,
Right.
accepting of, trans identifying kids or anything like that, you realize like, okay, this is something that's concerning. So what was like the step that like what were your first steps to actually bring it to the, I guess, become more formal in your complaints to the clinic, within the clinic itself?
So some of the things we started kind of advocating for was a more robust case presentation and a case conferencing. So I think there are some teams that do this really well, where you have somebody directly that you're supposed to bring the patient forward to, bring it maybe forward a week in advance so everybody can review the case and those kinds of things. So we started asking and advocating for potentially more structure. So can we have a case conferencing where we are able to review the patient in its entirety? And one of the things that we just were really struggling with was that there was not any sort of good oversight in order to case conference in a way that would be productive and not end with people yelling at one another, or yelling and then the team meeting ending and then a flurry of phone calls afterwards individually. Hospitals and situations like these should have structures in place then to also bring in upper level outside individuals. So say you have a case conference, there is divisions, then there should be a structure in place. Who's the decider? Where does it go to next? Is there a risk management team? Is there an ethical team? How do those things kind of work out? And so it was becoming situations where we were becoming really almost stagnant as a overall team, because we kept hitting the same hurdles over the same type of patients. So then a couple things started happening. So one of them was, in situations like that, I think that data is helpful. So if anybody is in situations where you are struggling in an ethical environment or in a workplace environment, to me, it needs to come back to data. And so we started collecting data sets to track the patients for whom we had concerns. So I think this is pretty public by now, we referred to this as a red flag list. We were placing patients on the list if there were red flags. The team knew that we were keeping this list. And then one of the things that really shook me later is we started to see that those who were on the red flag list were those who were later being transitioned over to the detransitioner list, because a few years in, we started getting a number of detransitioners. And so that's not a good feeling when you and your assessment say, this person is a red flag, there are enough red flags, they don't feel like they're within guidelines. And then you see 6, 9, 12 months later, the transition from them from that list to a detransitioner list. That there's a couple takeaways from that. One, red flags started to feel like to me that they could have some predictive value, but that also meant that again, it was just another element of, okay, I'm not crazy. There is something going on here. And we were then trying to raise those concerns to administrators and people higher up. The problem with this model of care that I see across the board universally is that it's treated as if it is the specialist of the most special kind of care, and none of the normalized processes in the medical realm can touch it because it's so very special. So when you would bring it forward to administrative and, bring it forward saying, hey, this study just came out of this country and I'm seeing things in Europe where there's some concerns. Everybody above would basically be like, well, I don't know anything really about this care. It's so specialty care. So we're just going to trust the two doctors.
Hmm.
And I think you see that systematically, and that's not.
Yeah. And what did they do with the detransitioner list? Like, what was the process in that clinic when individuals decided this wasn't a path that was working for them?
Unfortunately, the fact that that list even existed also was because of myself and the RN were concerned enough to even start it.
Hmm.
The
Right. Like they
clinical,
didn't have any tracking.
no,
Right. Okay.
no.
And how did they alert you that they decided it wasn't for them? They would call up and say like, "Hey, I'd like to
Yeah,
get taken off of it," or
yes. Or
was it usually the
oftentimes,
parents? Yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
yes, it was oftentimes we would hear from a parent, or we would reach out for some reason. Somebody missed a number of follow-ups. They hadn't picked up any refills, and the parent would say, "Oh, we've stopped this. They're not doing this anymore."
Hmm.
And again, I think part of that is the structural problem of this center as well, because the only two full-time staff who actually saw every single chart was myself and the nurse.
Yeah.
Yeah, everybody
Right.
else saw this little sliver of the entirety of the center. And sometimes too, you can't assess something without a big enough picture. You have to know what you're looking at. If you're only looking at one puzzle piece, you're not going to know what's in front of you.
Yeah. So you were uniquely positioned to really manage the whole case, right? Case management is extremely important.
Yes, and I
Yeah.
completed all of the intake. So every new incoming patient, I spoke to their parent and did their intake assessment also. And so that also started cluing me into, oh, we've got a shifting demographic, we've got shifting numbers, we see these explosions in different areas. And I don't I don't think I'm special in any way, but I definitely had enough just scientific curiosity to go, this is not, when you told me we were treating this kind of patient and then this totally different kind of patient is the ones showing up, it just felt like it didn't really entirely work out.
Yeah. So was there any part of you that wanted to just say, you know what, like this is just the way they handle things around here. They're probably right. Like, and or the potential consequences are too great. Like, was there a part of you that's like, let me just, go along, get along to go along, or go along to get along, and not move forward, you know, beyond the clinic?
That could have worked, except seeing the patients who were being harmed.
Yeah.
And so I think part of it came down to seeing the patients who are supposed to be the success stories. So being told, we put this patient on a puberty blocker, then we put them on cross-sex hormones, and they've been on this medicalized path for 3-4 years. And if the theory holds, they should be better. Their mental health should be better. They should be, I hear news stories where a few parents will step up and say, well, my kid is doing great and they're thriving. And what I struggle with is that, what I was seeing in the whole day's worth of clinics just over and over again was it was it was the rare kid that was thriving, and it was the
Mm,
overarching kid who was just they were just significantly struggling, mentally ill. And then it was interesting because even the kids where we would say, well, this kid is thriving, when you took a step back and you looked at it from a psychosocial assessment lens, the things that you would want to see teens thriving at, they also weren't achieving.
mm,
So, my local newspaper put up a patient video after the story broke. They put up this video of this patient, and this video is supposed to be, showing the success of this model and how this kid who got recorded for the local newspaper was doing great. And when I was watching the video from the training that I have and how to do psychosocial assessments, I saw a young person whose identity had shifted after they had already, so they were initially stating that they were trans. Now, 5 years into this, now their identity had shifted now into some kind of vague non-binary. They had dropped out of school. They were still living at home. They were not working. Their bedroom was, filled with stuffed animals. Like, they were the things that you would be wanting to see in like a 16, 17, 18-year-old, those kind of patients, you're not seeing. Like a driver's license, a part-time job, talking about moving out, being an adolescent and doing those separation things from parents. You just weren't seeing even in the kids that were claimed to be successful.
Right.
And so when I just saw enough patient harms, there was an element where I thought, I can't just walk away. I really tried. I left the center and I tried to just walk away. And what I think part of what fundamentally just kind of kept pulling me back in is seeing within my state, with a lot of these legislative pushes, seeing falsehoods being presented to the legislature. So, I would characterize them as lies about what we were doing and what the outcomes were. And I think you see a lot of that in this too. Oh, nobody gets surgery. No regret, no, small numbers of detransitioners. Well, those things aren't true if 30% of our patients we lost to follow-up. I can't tell you that we had 1% detransitioners because we lost 30% of them.
Yeah.
Like, it just systematically as a whole was not working.
Yeah. So I'm hearing like kind of what didn't allow you to just remain silent was your cognizance and awareness that harm was going on. And that was very uncomfortable for you. Like, you couldn't just sit with that. So what was the process? Like, you realize, okay, I need to kind of take this to the next step, and maybe even instruct those people who want to whistleblow in their own life, for something that they see. Like, what's the process like? What was the process like for you? Both negative and positive.
I don't know how public some of this has been, but I actually originally tried to set up meetings through an intermediary at the university. So somebody I met who worked at the university, but who I also knew had some other misgivings, who was higher up. And she had tried to arrange a few meetings with some higher ups, like oversight. And as those meetings were kind of getting worked out through email, I would, they knew in the emails, this is a person who used to work in the center, they have concerns. The kind of the language that we were hearing back was basically, well, I just want your evidence, just turn everything over, and then, we're going to quietly take care of it. And that just, it didn't seem like they were really interested in really changing anything or even really investigating. I feel like if internally they were like took it seriously and said, yes, we want to investigate, we want to have like a sit down meeting with a few people to really hear what you have to say. And instead it was just kind of a little bit of the runaround. And I just felt like the university was trying to just figure out what I had and then sweep it under the rug and make it silent.
Right. Like, almost, let's see if we have liability questions.
Right. And then, so that wasn't, I just didn't feel like there would actually be any sort of change or outcome going down that route. So then I reached out to a a group. I sent them a really vague email. I emailed the SEGM general website and I just said, hey, I used to work in a gender center. I have a lot of concerns and I just need to talk to somebody. Can somebody help me out? And it was a really interesting response because SEGM, I think rightfully, had to figure out if they needed to vet me. And I had a few Zooms where I met with a couple different doctors. I think that pretty quickly the docs realized, A, I did actually work in a gender center, and B, I do actually know what I'm talking about. I met with, and I know this has been public, but I met with Dr. Julia Mason. She has some ties to my hometown. So we had coffee, and I think every step along the way, everyone that I spoke to really kept putting it back in my court. What do you want to do with this? What do you feel safe doing? What do you feel comfortable doing? And then what is the outcome that, you wanted to see? What do you want to see come from this? And those were really helpful steps in the process. And I was eventually linked to an attorney. And then the attorneys and I met and had a number of conversations, very similar. Where do you feel safe? What do you want to do with this? How do you want to proceed? Every step of the way, my local attorney would check back in and say, what about this draft? Look at this. What do you feel about this? So they always were checking in on kind of where I was at. I felt like I could have put a halt at any time, but eventually it led to me meeting with the attorneys with the state and talking about what I knew and what I had seen. And I found a number of people who just expressed a lot of real sincere concern. One of the hardest parts about these centers is there's so little data and so little actual information coming out from them. One of the things I still think would really help the public in general is if these centers would be more transparent. How many kids are you seeing? How many of those kids are going on a blocker? How many of those kids are going on to cross-sex hormones? How many of those are not? How many patients are you seeing that you're screening and you're saying no to?
Yeah, like transparency.
Right.
And to get a sense of practices and,
yes.
Nationwide consensus, even just to know what's going on.
Yeah, we still don't see any of that. And when you see some of the testimony at some of the legislative levels, me knowing that our center was being misrepresented is really concerning that other centers are misrepresented too.
What do you mean by misrepresented?
One of the straws that broke the camel's back was watching the clinicians I work with testify in front of the state legislature and not tell the truth about what we were doing.
Right. Okay. So usually when you're not up to something shady, you could be honest, right? It's usually when you're doing something that is wrong, you feel like you have to lie about.
If you feel like you cannot tell the truth in public about what you're doing something wrong. And so to go forward and say, surgery is absolutely not on the table for anyone, or, that mental health is just so many of the elements, saying surgery is absolutely not on the table for anyone. Yet in my own role, I'm sitting in the waiting room as I know minor patients are having surgery, or knowing in clinic that my clinicians are looking at surgical scars on individuals' chests who are minors, knowing that that's occurring, and then hearing them say surgery is absolutely not on the table for anyone. That does not work. Again, those are those are those gut check level ethical feelings when you hear somebody saying that and you know the work that you're doing. There's no way you feel like you're in doing the right thing then if the people have to lie about it.
Yeah. So were there any what would you say were some of like the negative outcomes of this, and or were there any in terms of like um whether it's people attacking your character, or would you say there's anything that was very unpleasant or anything that you had feared in kind of going public with your concerns?
Yeah, there's been a lot of negative elements. We've lost a number of family friends. I've had family members who are no longer really engaging with us. It's quite isolating in some ways, and in some ways it's been really helpful. I think on a local level, it's quite isolating. So I'm still employed at the university. It is I feel like I'm accommodated, not necessarily really I think that they didn't really want me to stay. The local level, I feel like there are definitely arenas in my life that, I probably wouldn't be, invited to any of the LGBT events or organizations or things like that. So there have been challenges. And yet at the same time, I now know so many other individuals that I'm in contact with, who I talk to every day, who I'm working with every day, who are amazing, wonderful, often other LGBT people. I think one of the toughest things about being in this kind of heterodox world is nobody should ever do this thinking that you're ever going to get a reward or a ribbon or a certificate. I think whistleblowers in general should know that if you're interested in doing this for some accolades, or nobody's gonna give you an award, and nobody's gonna buy flowers, and nobody's gonna do anything like that. We are kind of ostracized in some way.
Right. So it sounds like that's an important thing to go into it recognizing that that's a possibility. And you touched on kind of having new people in your life, but like what would you say were the positives that came of this, like the rewards, no certificate or flowers, but were there like rewards internally or externally that made it worth it potentially?
I sleep so much better than I ever did working in the center. My overarching feeling of just doing the right thing. I don't feel ethically torn and at odds and conflicted. I don't think I've used the term, I have ethical concerns since I left. And I was working in a situation where, to have that phrase come up on the regular is a really stressful, challenging position to be in. So there's a lot of calm and ease that comes from being on the other side. I think in other realms, for other whistleblowers, you might have a different experience. I think the question around gender medicine right now is so toxic and difficult and volatile that it just has created so many divisions. But I feel embraced, and I feel like the people that are working on this issue from a calm scientific perspective from the opposite side are some of the smartest people. And I think you have to be really intelligent and yet really courageous, yet also slightly, you have to have some pretty thick skin to be working on this issue.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I feel like a lot of kindred spirits in that regard.
Yeah, very interesting, and also like very compassionate and kind people in that space
Yeah,
as well, right? Like
yeah,
you could get like this image of like they don't care, but like these people care about kids. Like these
they
people,
care a lot.
yeah, and
Yeah.
they're yeah, I totally agree. Would you say it took courage to do what you did?
It took fortitude. It took some gut kind of grit, kind of, I'm going to do this. And um, I, I guess in some ways that is courage. I didn't feel necessarily courageous on some level because I waited so long. I really tried, in retrospect, I like tried all these different avenues, like try to do this way, try to do this way, try to do this way. And I think I just waited a little bit longer than I should have. I should have spoke up earlier.
Yeah,
So that
and
kind of haunts me.
right. I can imagine, you know, it likely does take a long time, but I could understand that wanting, like, wishing having done it sooner. While I imagine there are people working at gender centers across the country who still feel like, you know, should I say anything? Should I just close my eyes to it? So there's definitely so much pressure to kind of just keep in line, because otherwise you're a bad
A lot of
person.
people leave though. I think the other thing is I think that people are either completely sold and bought in and are not looking at this wider picture, or what I could have done that would have been easier, which, for a long time my spouse wanted me to do, was just leave, just get a different job and get out of there. Like, this place
Yeah.
is a toxic mess, just get out. And that wasn't me being courageous. That was me being stubborn that I didn't leave.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing with your experience really reflects a lot of the people who I spoke to, where they kind of see the truth for what it is, right? Like they get a really good sense of, like, you know, what they're seeing that's wrong, and it really violates their sense of I don't know, like their sensitivity to truth and being guided by truth and honesty
Yeah.
and integrity. And it's almost like they, there's such discomfort with that, that it's almost like avoiding that or like moving
Yeah.
away from the discomfort of unethical behavior, the discomfort with lies, and just moving and letting, like, once you know the truth and you question yourself, right? Because usually it's in the presence of a system working to
Yeah.
really subdue it. But once you kind of get that feeling, there's almost like no choice, right?
No,
It's just like,
you're
how do I want
absolutely
to
right.
do it? And so
Yes.
many people
It's
are like,
more how instead of, yeah.
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 So, I, just to wrap up, I'm curious, what do you think is the future of this type of care, for individuals, for younger individuals who are distressed about their gender, distressed, or, are experiencing questioning of it? Like, where do you see this going? Where should this go? And I know that's like could be a tough question, um, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts about that.
So the simplest answer is for kids and young people who are experiencing concerns and questions around their gender, it should be treated within the realm of a mental health concern that requires therapy, that requires compassion, that requires the adults and the individuals around the person to support them so that they can thrive and function in their life. And that said, I think that means that we need to step away from the medical model. So the medical model right now is not working for kids and young people for a couple serious reasons. One, we don't scientifically know that it actually works at all. So if the model itself, but then because of the culture bound issues that we're seeing right now, we do not have the diagnostic way to differentiate between those who are within a culture bound social contagion paradigm versus those young people who potentially might have gender questioning concerns for the long term of their life. And because we cannot safely diagnostically differentiate between those two groups right now, it is not a safe model to continue to have functioning in the Western world at this time.
Yeah, I think you put that so well. And while no one has yet given you an official reward, if there was an Elliot Kaminetzky reward for awesomeness, I would totally give that to you. But maybe we'll make one day. And I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us and really for modeling, really acting upon the truth that you know in your life, that you've found in your life. And I think that's the most important thing we could do as people. And there's always going to be positive outcomes and negative outcomes. But, for all the people listening, it does help you sleep better at night. And it's the best way to live your life.
Yeah.
Yeah. So really, thank you so much for
Thank you
joining
for
us.
having me.
All right. Awesome.
All right. Thanks, Elliot.
All right. Be well.
Bye.